In this episode, I'll show you how to replace the default login form with your own. Why would you want to do that? Well, apart from custom styling, there is an additional functionality you don't have accessible by default, such as the ability to reset a forgotten password or use a social login, such as Google or Facebook, or a passwordless login, where the app sends a magic link to your mailbox. If you follow along coding this project with me, at the end of this video you will have a custom login page with additional features. You will also gain a good understanding of the login and the logout process. What I have here is the default login form, the one I'm looking to replace. It looks decent, and let me admit right away, I'm not a designer. It would take me a while to come up with something that's not only functional, but is also visually appealing. Luckily, I don't have to start from scratch. There is a ton of ready-to-use designs I can choose from. If I search login form or login form with social login in Google, I get a ton of links that lead to ready-to-use examples. This very first link, however, leads to W3 Schools website. It caught my attention because W3 Schools is a reputable source of tutorials when it comes to anything web. Check out the tutorials if you haven't already. So let me just click through the link. It brings me to an example of a login with social media. It says login with social media or manually. And that's exactly the split I'm looking for. I certainly want to keep the possibility for the user to use their username and password. And I showed how to store these credentials safely in a database in my previous episode. Check it out if you haven't. However, I also want to be able to use other means of signing in. I definitely want social logins, such as login with Facebook or Google. I also want to be able to restore a forgotten password, and I definitely want to be able to onboard new users by supporting the sign up. I even might want to consider passwordless login, where the application sends a magic link to your mailbox. Okay, so this looks promising. Let me just look at the source code. It's the HTML part of it, and styling. Okay, as usual with W3 Schools, their examples are concise and to the point. And that's also something that I've deemed quite essential when you consider like using someone else's source code. I always ask myself two questions. A, do I understand what's going on? And B, am I happy to maintain it? And I would say in this case, it's a yes to both of these questions. So let me just download these sources and incorporate them in my project. Before I move on and explain how to replace this default login form with a custom one, I feel I should explain how it all works under the hood. If I go to my IDE and check the security configuration, I can see I didn't have to do much. I merely said, well, use a login form as a way of authentication, but for instance, I didn't have to specify that this particular page should be available under /login. That just works out of the box. How is it possible? Well, to understand how it works, I'll just use one of the slides from my introductory video. If you haven't watched it, I highly suggest you do, because it's not that long and it explains how the Spring Security Framework works in a nutshell. And Spring Security is essentially just a bunch of servlet filters. These 12 filters. What they do is each incoming HTTP request is captured, intercepted by these filters, and at the end of it, there is HTTP response. It's either successful and a web client gets the requested resource, such as an HTML page, or it's rejected because the user is either not authorized or authenticated, or both. So out of all these 12 filters, I'm only interested in two right now. The first one is login page generating web filter. That's exactly the one that takes care of this login page. Let me have a look at it, and I'll have a look at the source code. So that's the filter. As you can see, it's available under get/login, meaning whenever I enter this URL in my browser, the filter kicks in and does its job, which is render an HTML page. You can see it uses Bootstrap under the hood that makes the output visually more appealing. But more importantly, it generates this form here. And that's how Spring works, under the hood. So it expects that the credentials are submitted via a login form. It's a post request as opposed to get request under /login. And the payload are user's credentials. So the username, so that's input type text, identified as username, but named as username, and same for password. So this form submission is handled by a different filter. So this filter is only responsible for generating of the login page. But when I fill in the credentials and hit the sign in button, then that's intercepted by this filter here, Server Web Exchange Reactor Context Web Filter. Now you might be asking yourself, why is it the entry point? Why doesn't it just follow the login page generating web filter? Well, that's because we don't know what the HTTP request is going to be. It might be the initial HTTP request when someone requests a protected resource, such as the user details page, and then is presented with a login page, has to log in and then enter the details. But it also might be that the user already provided the user credentials, and in which case I need to make that distinction at the very entry point of the whole chain. So this server web exchange reactor context web filter, if I look at the implementation, it's actually buried here in the server HTTP security. But this is how the authentication logic looks like. It expects this /login route as a post request, and it handles the user submission. It handles the payload, and also configures like how to deal with the failures, and how to log out, etc. So yeah, this is how it works under the hood. So now, when we know why the initial configuration is so minimal, we are in position to change it. I've added a new template, login.html, where I copy the HTML from the example. Always remember to add attribution. I've also created a new directory for static resources, and this main CSS obviously contains the style sheet I copied from the example too. Yeah, before I move on, just a few comments around the login HTML. So basically I use a templating engine. That's why this custom namespace. As I explained, in sync with how the Spring security works under the hood. This is my login form with the expected payload, username and password, and it also goes to the default /login route. So I'm not going to change anything about that. So my login form itself is purely, the change is purely visual. The form submission, I leave it up to the Spring Security Framework to handle that through the filters, as I explained. Perhaps I should briefly mention why this method here, it's a post method and not a get method. So the major difference between a post and a get is that whichever payload is sent with a GET request, it gets appended at the end of the URL. So as you can imagine, the URLs where I access different pages in my web application, login page included, they end up in application logs, such as access logs, where I can do some statistics on which pages are being accessed the most, or also Google Analytics. Quite frequently in production systems, Google Analytics is used to understand like the trends, what people are looking for on a particular website. So if I used GET, what I would start to see that with my login URLs, they would be enhanced with additional information. They would contain a query string with usernames and what's even worse, with passwords in plain text. And that's something I definitely do not want to happen, because then different people would be outside of even my organization would be able to see like who is logging in and with what credentials. With post request, I don't need to worry about that, because post method does not modify the URL. All the payload is sent as part of the request body, so it stays within the server that deals with the actual authentication. I've added my custom login page, styled it, all looks good, and it's aligned with the default configuration, right? I did not change anything. So let's see what happens when I just restart the application. Will it actually display the new login form for me? Okay, so the application has started. Let me go back to the browser, and as you can see, it did not work. It did not replace the default login form. Why is that? Well, it's because I need to be explicit. If I want to use my own route or my own custom page, I need to declare a specific route, even though the route is the exact same as the one that ships with Spring, that is /login. I still need to explicitly declare it, at which point the Spring will stop using the default login page generated one of the filters and will look for my custom route. So let me just do that. Okay, so now I need to make Spring aware I want to use my own custom login page. Simple, just /login. Now, mind you that this is no longer handled by Spring, so I'm also responsible for adding the router. I need to route to this. I need to handle this route. So I created a new class, router config. A lot is happening here right now, but just focus on this particular piece of code. So that's those of you who have worked with Spring MVC are probably familiar with the concept of controllers. Those of you who are not, there's a link in the description section below this video. Go check it out. So here I'm basically saying, all the GET requests under /login should be routed to a login template, which is this login HTML page. Mono, again, is just because of reactor. It's meant to be, you know, reactive or tie into the reactive flow, so that's why I wrap it into mono. Okay, so I got a custom routing, and I declared that /login route explicitly in my configuration. So let me just restart the application and see if it finally works. I go to the browser. Will I see the custom login page now? No, I won't. Instead, I got an error. Well, it says too many redirects. Well, that's a hint. It means that there is something missing here in the configuration. To understand what's missing, you need to again, I understand, like this /login route is no longer special. It's no longer the one that ships with Spring. So there's no way for the Spring Security Framework to know that this is not a protected resource. You know, here I said any request should require authentication. And here I define a new route. Spring is not aware of it. And I need to allow access to it. So that's why I just need to add this piece of configuration path matchers, just say /login and permit all. Well, I should also allow for any style sheets be downloaded, because if I go to my login page, I refer to main CSS. Again, if I don't quote-unquote whitelist access to it, it won't be able to apply the style sheets. All right, so one last time, restarting the app. Reload, and there I go. Here's my custom login page. Before I wrap it up, I wanted to quickly talk about routing. For me to route into this custom login page, I used a controller. For those of you who are familiar with Spring MVC, you know that's a concept you obviously know very well. Those of you who find this strange, or this is the first time you see this, or not sure what I'm talking about, there is a link attached in the description section below this video. Go check it out. Okay, so controllers is something that's been long supported by Spring MVC. It's obviously also available with reactive web applications and works really well. It allows me to apply some additional smarts, you know, out of the box. For instance, I don't have to work with raw HTTP requests. They're, you know, automatically or automagically transformed into custom business objects. For instance, I could have user details instead of HTTP request, object, etc., etc. So there are many benefits to controllers, but there are also drawbacks. And one of the disadvantages that's kind of big for me is that I don't get a clear picture of all the endpoints I have in my application. What I mean is, you know, your routers or routing is scattered across a single file or potentially multiple files. Imagine I would have another route here that says get user details to be handle user details. I would go to my user details page, whatever. And that's fine. It's not a big deal. these two methods are one-liners, and it's still clear it's clearly, it's still clearly visible. I still get a full picture like of all the routes I have. But then I also might want to, I don't know, process custom orders. That's nothing to do with logging in or authentication or security. So I'd probably want to create a custom controller for it, maybe order controller. And then I would have something like post, request for order processing. Maybe the logic would be slightly more involved, so there would be more lines of code, and then I would have a bunch of other endpoints. And then I would do something completely different, again, a new controller class and another bunch of endpoints, etc., etc. All to say is, in any production system of a reasonable size, I don't have a good view of all the routes there are in my application. So that's one disadvantage, and it might not be a big problem to many of you. Another issue that comes with controllers is, what if I want to apply something that they all have in common? And then Spring provides mechanism for common error handling, etc. But it's kind of detached from these controllers, and it's hard to see how it all works. Or I might have like a base controller where I could have, for instance, shared logic for measuring response times or some custom metrics that I want to apply to all of the controllers that are in my application. But I just don't want to use inheritance only to gain this, common or shared code capability. So in the end, I decided to scrap controllers altogether, so just remove them and take a different approach. And that different approach is a new routing DSL that ships specifically with WebFlux. So this is what I'm talking about. It's a DSL that describes routing in my application at a single place. So I just declare single bean, the router, and it will have a reference to all the endpoints that are in my application. And I could have post, orders, etc. So regardless of which domain do these endpoints relate to, this is the place where you find them, all of them. And obviously I could use comments, say this is authentication, this is business, orders, for instance. So that's now quite clear, and it's easy to see all of the API that my application exposes to the outer world. Now, when it comes to these handlers, they are so-called handler functions, and they all share the same signature. They accept the server request and produce server response. It also makes it easy to apply some common logic to all of them at once. And I might show that in one of the upcoming videos. But, I don't need inheritance to be able to apply something that they all have in common and still keep them independent from each other. So that I like that. But obviously with advantages, there are also drawbacks. And if I just rewind a little bit, get rid of the stuff I don't need to, that doesn't need to be here. Okay, and re-enable my DSL. If I compare this route to a custom login page head-to-head, controllers approach that essentially just returns a string, and that's all all the framework needs to understand that I mean this very page, as opposed to the handler function, where I'm all of a sudden responsible for generating the full response object. So now I need to be explicit. I need to say, well, this particular handler function generates HTTP 200 as in HTTP OK, which routes to the login something. That something is determined by the media type. So it's an HTML page, so okay, so it must be login HTML. So I need to help the framework way more to for it to be able to determine which particular view I want to display. So these two approaches, I think they're like equivalent. It's a matter of taste. Feel free to use whichever suits best your particular need, but for me, I kind of like this new DSL, and I will stick to it for the rest of this tutorial. This brings me to the end of what I wanted to show you today. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this episode useful. Give me a like if you did, and subscribe if you don't want to miss out on updates in this channel. As usual, you'll find a complete source code in the description section below. Next time, I will touch upon social login. I'll show you how to log in with Facebook or Google. And yeah, see you around in the next episode. Bye.